So welcome to our video presentation. I'm Rebecca Johnson, and with my co-author Simone Zhang, we'll be talking about the rise of algorithms in US social policy and the older methods that algorithms might replace. So our focus here is on a particular type of algorithm. So algorithms that might take a pool of people who might potentially benefit from a supportive social service, something like a housing voucher, a tutor for students, health insurance, and those algorithms might try to evaluate who needs help the most urgently. And this stands in contrast to algorithms that, like those in criminal justice risk assessment, that try to assess the risks that people pose to society, or algorithms like hiring assessments that try to assess the value that people pose to organizations. And when policymakers are judging need or trying to judge need, algorithms would enter into an existing bureaucratic counterfactual. And in social service bureaucracies, we know that the counterfactual is not a bureaucrat with full discretion over to help, whoever she sees fit. Instead, the counterfactual is policymakers choosing categories, things like being low income, being a veteran, looking for work, that give individuals priority for access to that supportive resource. So we call this categorical prioritization, and in the remainder of the talk, Simone and I will outline categorical prioritization in a few different steps. So first, we'll review what is categorical prioritization. We'll discuss its prevalence across US social policy. We'll then discuss what changes with algorithmic prioritization, both in the abstract and with reference to a specific case study. Then we'll discuss the contributions and relationship with related work. So categorical prioritization consists of 3 steps, and what these steps try to do is manage the high-dimensional nature of human need when deciding who needs help most urgently. So this table depicts the 3 steps. The first step is policymakers manually select attributes that they think entitle an individual to help through some social service. So things like, should we prioritize mothers of dependent children? What about veterans? What about those in poverty? Or should we, espouse a bootstraps narrative and only prioritize those who are looking for work? The second step is manually coarsening continuous attributes like age or household income into categories. So things like income falling below some threshold. The third is once we have the set of categories, policymakers deliberate on decision rules for mapping combinations of categories into priority. So if you're an adult, you also need to be looking for work. If you have a felony conviction, even if you're a member of many other prioritized categories, does that felony conviction exclude you from social assistance? So those are the 3 steps, and categorical prioritization is common across US social policies across a few different domains. So first is in the domain of health. Things like age cutoffs, income cutoffs are used for government health insurance. The second example is in K through 12 education. We discuss in the paper categories in school finance formulas. They also operate as plus factories, as in lotteries for spots in selective magnet or charter schools. And then Simone later will discuss an example in the case of Section 8 voucher housing assistance or categories for voucher waitlists. So a lot of these social policies are currently only using categorical prioritization. So our next step is to ask what might change if some of these social policies shift to using algorithmic prioritization. So first, to define what we mean by algorithmic prioritization, we're talking about cases of algorithmic prioritization that generally involve 3 steps. So first, policymakers select a target outcome to predict. So in the case of education, they might select, the risk of a student repeating a grade. In the case of housing assistance, they might assess the risk of eviction or the risk of experiencing homelessness. They then use a high-dimensional set of features, a mix of categories and continuous attributes to try to predict that outcome selected in step 1. And then finally, through the train test split process, validation, various accuracy metrics, the model inductively selects and weights features that are highly predictive of that outcome and assigns priority scores to the individuals that can be used to shape assistance. So to make the contrast with categorical prioritization more concrete, this is pretty different from the process of categorical prioritization. So with categorical prioritization, there's really no defined target outcome. There's no, basis for prioritization. Instead, things like mother or looking for work or veteran reflect different values that policymakers hold about who should receive assistance. In contrast, in algorithmic prioritization, some target outcome needs to be formalized. The second difference is that for reasons of parsimony and because policymakers want to narrow down the pool, they often manually select a few categories that entitle people to assistance. In contrast, algorithmic prioritization is defined oftentimes by a high-dimensional feature set. The third contrast is that, again, for parsimony, policymakers often coarsen continuous attributes like age, household income into categories. In contrast, algorithmic prioritization, the feature set contains a mix of attribute types. Finally, in categorical prioritization, there's deliberation about how categories should be ranked relative to each other, how different and or logic should apply to different categories. In contrast, in algorithmic prioritization, the predictive model learns mapping of different features and interactions. So with those contrasts in mind, I'm going to pass it to Simone, who's going to discuss a case study of categorical prioritization and discuss the morally relevant differences between that and algorithmic prioritization.
All right, so in the second half of this talk, I'll discuss the case of housing choice vouchers, which subsidize the cost of rent for low-income households in the United States. Although it's the largest rental assistance program in the US, the program is only sufficiently funded to support around 1 in 4 eligible households. This means that the bureaucracies that distribute vouchers at the local level, housing authorities, must triage access, and they often do so via locally devised policies that advance some groups of applicants ahead of others on voucher waitlists. This case draws on a broader study in which we interviewed 22 housing authority officials and analyzed over 1,300 local policies. So here's an example of one such policy from a small city in Indiana. And you'll notice the policy attaches a specific number of points to qualifying under different categories, from being a resident to being considered somebody who's working to being a veteran. These points are summed, and the higher an applicant's point total, the earlier they get access to a voucher. People who don't qualify for priority, meanwhile, are served in the order in which they applied. We use this case to consider how might shifting to algorithmic prioritization shape inequality. To address this question, we draw on the work of many in the fact community and highlight the inequality implications of 3 differences between categorical and algorithmic prioritization. First, whether the basis of prioritization is formalized. Second, how the approach interacts with power inequalities in society. And third, whether decision rules are manually chosen or inductively derived from a model. Now to step through the first of these, formalization. So we note that because categorical prioritization doesn't require selecting a particular formal target outcome, one of its benefits is that it might be more readily compatible with value pluralism, allowing the expression and balancing of multiple values that may be important locally within a particular policy domain. In the voucher case, we observed housing authorities prioritizing an array of categories, with some choices aiming to affirm commitments to local community, others helping those experiencing significant hardship, and still others seeking to enforce things like particular societal norms. A drawback of categorical prioritization, however, is that in practice, policy goals can be ambiguous and based on murky defaults, with policy choices often lacking a traceable basis. Some officials we interviewed, for instance, struggled to offer a rationale for their policies or could only offer a very minimal account. Notably, officials also sometimes suggested that their ad hoc assessments of an applicant's deservingness, which at times, drew heavily on assumptions about different social groups, were in fact objective or simply common sense. What then might change under a shift to algorithmic prioritization? One potential drawback of algorithmic prioritization could be that having to choose a particular target outcome could disrupt achieving an effective balance between different competing values. So it could also increase reliance on measured outcomes produced by exclusionary, biased, or harmful social structures and processes, as many before us have argued. If policymakers, for instance, choose to model the risk of homelessness, but measure it based on records of stays in formal homeless shelters, that could potentially lock out especially marginalized, unhoused populations who might feel uncomfortable or unsafe in those settings, or whose lives just simply don't align with the assumptions of state record-keeping systems. On the flip side, however, needing to actually choose a target outcome could enforce deliberation about the goals of assistance. It could help ensure that important questions about goals are an actively negotiated choice through having to answer questions like, should assistance help people get into housing or prevent displacement from housing? Should it target those at greatest risk of an adverse outcome or those predicted to benefit most? Now, a second difference is how the two approaches interact with inequalities in power. Categorical prioritization could beneficially present a lower barrier to entry for community engagement. However, choices may still reflect the perspectives of relative elites as they're made amidst broader inequalities in civic participation and unequal advocacy. Nearly all of our interviewees, for instance, reported that prospective voucher holders never really weighed in on local policies, and policies were instead more often shaped by the leaders of local community organizations, resulting in groups with a formal organizational presence being prioritized. Policies were also informed by the particular commitments of the people who happened to be in the room. So, as one official explained, the executive director happens to be a veteran himself, my father also a veteran, so creating a special preference for veterans that took no thought at all. What then might change under a shift to algorithmic prioritization here? So one potential benefit is that stigmatized or hidden groups, such as people with substance use challenges, could achieve priority even if they were to lack political representation or face resistance from policymakers. An important drawback that many have previously noted, however, may be that algorithmic prioritization could further shift power toward technologists and technocrats who may be distant from impacted communities. Now for difference 3. So we note that one benefit of categorical prioritization is allowing bureaucracies and policymakers to draft rules that make sense for them, that allow them to express meaningful commitments to particular help seekers, and that are feasible to implement on the ground. A drawback, however, is that the rules that they come up with can be arbitrary, based on gut instinct and folk theories of poverty. As illustrated in the quote to the right here, they might be designed based on empirically dubious but quite popular notions, like the fact that many people don't have jobs simply because they're not sufficiently motivated. If decision rules were instead inductively learned based on predicting some focal outcome, one benefit could be rules that learn and recognize complex interactions or hidden attributes associated with greater need or marginal benefit. A drawback, of course, is that it may tend to result in more complex procedures and that are more difficult for important stakeholders to really make sense of. To close, here we've sketched out the primary approach taken across many US social policies to decide who needs or deserves help in context of scarcity, what we refer to here as categorical prioritization. Rather than humans with full discretion, this bureaucratic counterfactual to algorithmic prioritization is characterized by a history of simplifying multidimensional need and informed by social constructions about who is morally deserving of help. We've highlighted key drawbacks and benefits of algorithmic versus categorical prioritization, and our hope is that it may support future scholarship to assess the on-the-ground distributional and procedural implications of these two approaches in concrete social policy settings. Thank you.